Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Vinnie Viola, principal and founder of Birch Island Real Estate Consulting. I want to welcome you to Construction Monitoring for Multifamily Projects. This is our 11th webcast, a live webcast in 2017, and probably one of the first where we're not talking solely about affordable housing. Blackstone, our guest today, has a much broader client base, market rate, luxury. So we're for today, sort of putting the affordability piece aside. I want to thank our friends here in Boston at Alden Torch for letting us use their beautiful conference room that's overlooking the Boston Harbor. I'm here with Sean Dundon, co-founder and principal of Blackstone Consulting, with offices in Portland and throughout the U.S., Sean. Amine, Riouch, also of Blackstone, is joining us dialed in from Shawnee, Georgia, just north of Atlanta. Good afternoon, Amine and Sean. How are you guys?
Doing well.
Very well.
Great to have you here. This is our fifth collaboration with you all, and really looking forward to diving into today's content. You know, we started talking about this market, I guess, multifamily webcast, Sean, in Memorial Day, and it took us, well, until, 2 weeks before Labor Day to get it together. So it's great to be here with you guys. Before we get started, let me just give our audience a brief overview of who you guys are. Sean, as I mentioned, co-founded Blackstone in 2001. He's managed hundreds of multifamily office, storage, distribution, hotel, retail development, and rehabilitation projects nationwide for equity position owners. Sean's clients include institutional investors, private equity investors, national and regional lending institutions, insurance companies, and law firms. No kidding, Sean. Amine, principal also at Blackstone Consulting, 25 years. This is a mouthful. 25 years experience in construction project management, feasibility studies, field engineering, construction document review, construction monitoring, plan and cost review, and construction administration, all important pieces in that development phase. Amine has extensive field experience, including observation and project management, to help guide Blackstone clients as they make critical decisions in development of new construction, renovation, acquisition, and disposition in their portfolio. So just a couple of really solid experts to have here. Effectively, Sean and Amine, over 50 years experience in construction-related matters. And so for the next hour, they're going to share thoughts on how multifamily projects can get into trouble, ways to reduce risk, and of course, answer your questions as we go through the webcast. We'll try and do these real time. You know, guys, I would venture to say that a number of folks in our audience today are probably end users of your construction inspection reports, certainly from who we've seen log in so far. Some of your clients, I know I was at Boston Capital and Boston Financial, an end user of the construction monitoring report. So we'll talk about some of those concepts today. And these guys are also going to share some real, I guess, some really good experiences, Sean. I mean, kind of things that do go wrong in the field, right?
That's right.
Yeah. Instead of one big case study at the end, we're going to talk about issues as we go. So there are our speakers today. Just some quick housekeeping before we get started. You all should have received in your email from me this morning a PDF of today's slides. It literally mirrors the slide content you're seeing now. Use that for taking notes. If you didn't get a copy, on your GoToWebinar panel is a handouts pane. You can download the PDF from there as well. So also on the GoToWebinar panel is the questions webinar window where you can type in your questions to us. And again, we'll do our very best to answer them real time. We're only talking for 60 minutes today. So we have 3 polls to get through in this webcast, just to get some feedback from the audience. And if we don't get to your question today, or it's a more involved kind of question, feel free, email Amine, Sean, or myself if it's related to something not, incredibly construction complex. I'd be happy to take your question as well. So here's our agenda. It's pretty straightforward. Initially, we had talked about doing adaptive reuse, but we've scratched that from this agenda. We have enough to talk about today. But, straightforward agenda. We'll start off by talking about some basic concepts for monitoring construction progress, and then transition into the kinds of challenges that Blackstone encounters with multifamily projects in development phase, again, for both new construction and rehab. Sean and Amine, again, will also share some real-world experiences of how projects get into trouble, associated delays, and, the financial impact of some of these problems. And at the end, they'll share some tips to manage construction risk. So Sean, this is not a webcast just about construction planning and due diligence, although certainly I think you'd agree attention to detail up front prior to breaking ground can make or break a project. You shared a quote with me and I put it up on the screen. I just thought kind of relevant to what we're talking about today. I'm sure you guys do this all the time. Planning is bringing into the future or into the present so that you can do something about it today. And what would that mean to you, Sean, in terms of planning for a construction project?
Right. Well, we can't have perfect information on every project, certainly, but the planning is critical to having a good outcome in terms of schedule, the quality of what you're producing, and staying within your budget. So the more certainty we can have on the front end of the project, the more we can minimize the impacts on the project as it progresses.
Sure.
So it really is both the equity and the debt side of any of these projects, whether it be new construction or rehab projects, really want to minimize change orders and increase certainty as they progress throughout the project, as anybody would. So they both take a look at it through that lens from the very beginning.
Right. And more often than not, you're reporting to them on construction progress, either debt or equity or both.
Or both.
Yeah.
Yep.
Amine, any thoughts before we dive into our first polls? Did we lose Amine?
Not really. I guess we're going to talk more about it in detail in the next few slides.
Yeah, very good. We will then launch our first poll. We just want to get a sense of kind of who you are out there, your current employer. If you all would, I'm going to launch this poll. Let's take 30 seconds and just get a sense of who's in the audience today. This will help our speakers. And then we'll share the results just so you all can see as well. We got a good mix so far. Let's take another 20 seconds. So this is what the audience is seeing, this blue screen.
Yeah.
Yep.
That's great.
Nice distribution today. Really good distribution. Let's wrap it up in 10 seconds. We've got about 85% of you voting. If we can get it to 100, that would be awesome. That happens occasionally. Let's close this poll in 5 seconds. So if you haven't voted. All right, and let me just share these results just so you all can know who's out there, get a sense. Nice distribution, equity providers, debt providers. The majority are developers, good. And then that 14% other, we're not always sure who the other are, but might be agency folks. But welcome all of you. It's great to have you here. This is our first poll again. We're going to do one more quick one just to get a sense of your current position so we know kind of the folks we're talking to. So if you would, let's just get this one wrapped up and then we'll dive into our content today. Another good mix as well.
Usually a good testament to the categories we picked if we can minimize other, but maybe we didn't hit the mark on this one.
Yeah. Well, I have to talk to Go too about expanding the multiple choice to more than 5 categories. let's wrap this up in about 5 seconds, and then I'll share these results as well. Amine, as you had hoped, about a quarter of this audience is construction project management, a third each are other and asset management, 2% origination, and some 15% are underwriters. So it's a good mix of folks.
How come those originators don't want to know what?
I know, right? I know. So let's move forward here. We're going to start off again with the basic tracking construction progress 101. This is the concepts we're talking about now is, you know, the kind of stuff I did at Boston Financial and Boston Capital as an asset manager, monitoring construction during development phase. And although this is not affordable housing, Sean, the concepts are all the same, whether it's market rate, luxury, no matter what kind of project it is, delays, time is money in these deals, right?
That is correct.
So this is, I like this. This is a subtitle from our last webcast, Plan for Success, but Expect the Unexpected. And that gets back to planning, as we were talking about earlier. You can do all the planning you want early on in the project, during due diligence, closing, monthly requisitioning. But yeah, always expect the unexpected is what you conveyed in the last webcast we did.
Yeah, it looks like from this flow diagram, we have probably a third or so of the people are involved in the first two blocks, the actual acquisition of the land or the acquisition that is to be rehabbed, and they maybe are involved until closing or the notice to proceed. And then maybe it gets transferred over to an asset manager, and there's a handshake there. We go into the monthly requisitions where an owner's rep on behalf of the equity or a construction loan monitor for the lender will look at the monthly requisitions and make a recommendation for funding to the lender, and also make the equity aware of any schedule delays, any quality issues, any potential pending change orders, whether there's too many RFIs, whether the job is properly resourced, that kind of thing. So that's the kind of thing you should expect on the monthly requisition feedback. Is it on schedule and on budget? And we'll talk about that more with an S-curve. And then on into construction, renovation, and completion, and then all the things you need to do to get your certificate of occupancy or your temporary certificate, place the asset in service at the end, and then, of course, the all-important lease and hand off to property operations. So getting through those punch list items, getting the warranty packages together, the project manual, and then handing it over to either a third-party management company or perhaps your own management company to lease up and operate.
And Blackstone is involved from all of phases, except as far as I know, you guys aren't doing lease up yet.
We are not. We also hand it off to property operations unless there's an issue with a warranty right off the bat.
Right. Good. A quick sidebar. As we were putting this content together, somehow we got into I don't know, Sean, you want to talk a little bit about trends or scope of work examples for ACT Rehab projects? What are you seeing more of this day in your line of business? More new construction, rehab, or is it just a mix as always?
It's a mix. It's very market specific. I think we would say the pendulum is switching back from new construction over to rehab, solely because, as most developers will tell you, for new construction, there's three things that you need to do a project: the availability of cheap funds, land costs, and low construction costs. And if you have 2 out of 3 of those, you can do a deal. And we're in a cycle now where usually 2 out of 3 of those land costs and construction costs are still very high. Lending costs are still pretty reasonable, although terms are changing a bit. So then people are saying, well, maybe I'd be better off to market quicker by rehabbing an existing asset and growing the rents that way, rather than trying to predict what's going to happen in 2 years when my project finally gets titled and built and comes to market. So the ACT Rehab volume seems to be increasing lately for us in some of the major markets, although pricing is still high to acquire those assets. There's also quite a move nationally to preserve existing housing. That's another reason to do rehab, because we are fearful of losing our existing housing stock, particularly in markets where there's really, really high demand for multifamily housing and also for affordable housing at certainly 80% of AMI and below. Even though we might consider that market rate, there are a lot of things for rent control and affordability requirements a lot of the major metros have. So we're seeing a lot of renovation in those areas as well. One thing, and we'll get to this with the next slide, but one of the conferences I go to all the time is National Multi-Housing Council. And they have these great young guns seminar, they're called, and they basically take a staff of acquisitions people for, rehab projects. They do 3 types of renovations: a light renovation, a moderate rehabilitation, substantial gut rehab. They pick 3 different markets and maybe even 3 different demographics to look at. And there's a panel of judges that sort of grade them on it, and then they try to project how they will work out. You know, which project is the best? Is it better to put $5,000 per unit into this, get it done quickly, and grow rents by, you know, $50 to $200, something like that? Is it better to hit the mark somewhere in the middle, maybe do a $10,000 to $15,000, maybe even $20,000 rehab, do your kitchens and baths and that kind of thing, do your flooring, do some of the common areas? Or is it better to really go a whole hog and maybe even do, you know, $50,000 to $100,000 a unit and maybe turn it into a condo, maybe really grow the rents? Or it could be a property that has severe occupancy problems, and the only way to pull it out is to do a gut rehab. So we're always asking our clients, you know, what is the objective? So we'll look at the asset at the very beginning and do a capital needs assessment, but it's critical for us to know what their scope of work is, what things they might encounter, like asbestos and other things, depending on whether they're doing a limited rehab, moderate, or substantial.
We'll talk about this later, but in this continuum of work, who's responsible for looking at, while we're doing this improvement to the property code, bringing it up to code? Is that the architect's responsibility, or is that something you're reviewing to ensure compliance?
The architects will make the representation of what codes they need to comply with, but we will be a check on that. To make sure that it is the proper code that needs to be complied with. And you're right, depending on the level of the rehab, you may trigger code requirements such as fire and life safety that with a limited rehab you may not trigger, but with a substantial gut rehab you might trigger that. You might trigger accessibility requirements and some other things. Can
I do kitchens and baths under limited rehab? Likely?
Probably not. Probably not.
All right. I thought so. All right. Somehow I may have skipped a slide here.
No, that's okay. I mean, we more or less covered that, but I think really what you're looking at is what's the level of upgrade that I want to put into the property versus the rent growth that I think I can achieve. If you know you cannot get 30% rent growth in your market simply because of the demographics, you're not going to go do a substantial rehab or maybe even a high-end moderate rehab. You might go in a lighter rehab and just be happy to increase occupancy and grow rents by 10% by doing something very limited. And just these upgrade lists are just a representative sample. But I think a lot of people are judged by what they think will happen based on the rehab. A lot of acquisitions and rehab people, their job is to hit the mark correctly and not guess and not overinvest in the property while the real estate cycle might be going down, or vice versa. You know, they want to hit a home run, but they also want to be pretty safe.
We've got our last poll here. This is a 60-minute webcast. We're 20 minutes into it, and I don't see any questions. Again, feel free to submit a question. We'll review it and put it out for discussion with Amine and Sean. But I'm going to launch this last poll. We're just looking for your opinion. How do you get the best bang for a buck in doing a rehab in a project? Which of the following really gets you the rents you're looking for? Just curious about that. And then we're done picking your brains for the day. So let's take about 20 more seconds. And then we're free-falling in conversation for the next 40 minutes. So. Well, that's what we kind of expected, right? So in order to, let's take 5 more seconds and another good round of voting. Thank you. And then we'll close this poll. Kind of what we expected, Sean. I mean, you're not gonna push rents and get the biggest bang for your buck unless you're doing something substantial.
Yeah, and I think we made a mistake. I apologize. The lighting package upgrade should have been landscaping package, but that's okay. So if anybody wants to change their vote, that should be the exterior. You basically, you get a sense of security when you walk onto the property.
Yeah.
Is it attractive from a curb appeal standpoint?
Yeah, I got you.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I mean, I think either way the answer probably would have been kitchens and baths are the biggest bang for the buck. Let's hide that and move forward here. So tracking construction progress once it breaks ground. We have a notice to proceed. In my world anyway, Sean, that was done monthly by reviewing requisitions, which could be anywhere from a 50-page to a 100-page submission, but always typically accompanied by some third-party inspection report. And we're going to spend just a few minutes now talking about those concepts. Amine, do you want to direct us in this discussion on progress?
Yes, so basically there's three critical elements or tools that are available for us during the construction monitoring. Obviously, you want your project to be completed on time, on budget, and you want to have a good end product. So
Right.
The scheduling tool, basically, the way it rolls up is a baseline schedule is usually developed pre-closing, and you want to make sure that schedule is included as an exhibit to your contract, because that's what you're going to hold the contractor to with respect to his contractual, the project contractual duration. And it's also critical once the notice to proceed is issued. That's when the clock starts ticking, especially
Sure.
if you have liquidated damages provisions in the contract, and sometimes there's delays in permitting, and the notice to proceed is tied up to not starting till you have all your permits, et cetera, et cetera. So that baseline schedule is very critical, and it's your benchmark. Then during the course of the project, you also want to make sure that the schedule gets updated, because obviously nothing in construction, nothing really happens the way we plan. There's always unforeseen conditions, coordination issues, procurement issues, et cetera, et cetera. Then another tool that's very critical also is the 90 days look ahead, where basically the contractors kind of take a section of the schedule and look at it in more detail. This is very important, and it's usually used not only for investors, developers to get a short-term forecast on their project, but also for stuff like coordination. When you go to sub-meetings, subcontractor meetings that are held every 2 weeks, that's when you try to tackle all your trades coordination. You want to make sure everybody can work around each other. If there are any issues, or if there's any re-sequencing that has to happen, that's where you first get a red flag, and you try to develop a plan of action and try to tackle it. And the last one, obviously, is recovery schedules. When things go wrong, let's say you're trying to get off the ground, and during the earthwork phase, that's where typically most of the risk lies. I mean, change order wise, we're accustomed to seeing almost 30 to 40% of the cost overrun related to the site work. So a recovery schedule is really a tool where you're trying to tackle the time components and looking at all your different options. Are we going to extend hours and work over weekends? Are we going to increase the manpower? Are we going to supplement a subcontractor that's poorly performing? Are we going to replace him? Then we're going to talk, the other tool is the budget, obviously. And usually part of the OEC meeting package, usually OEC meetings are held every 2 weeks on significant projects, or I would say mid-size to a large project, whereby OEC, by the way, stands for Owner, Architect, Contractors Meeting, where we basically, everybody meets on that table and try to resolve any issues, discuss the financial aspects of the project, the design issues, and also that's when we track all the there's a whole package of logs, and these logs are very critical. The first one is the PCO log, or the pending change order logs. So if there's anything out there that you're going to have to deal with, you want to make sure you have sources of funding available for it. Is it driven by the design, a poor design, or is it driven by unforeseen conditions? Is it upgrades? So these are things you look for, and obviously you want to make sure you have enough contingency or game plan as to how these cost overruns going to be addressed. Then you have your request for information log, and a lot of time from an investor or lender aspect, that's kind of they don't spend a lot of time looking at it, but typically an RFI is issued when there's something not clear in the field, when there's a question raised by a subcontractor, where he's looking up for direction from the design team, the owner, the materials testing firm, the engineers of record. And a lot of time, I would say more than 40%, an RFI would end up with either cost impact or delay impact. So it's always good to scan through that log and see if there is any RFI related to that's going to have a cost impact. And the last one is your submittal log, and that's also very critical because that gives you, and it's directly related to the schedule. The submittal log is basically where the subcontractor will submit a shop drawings, products, specifications, and that's where really all the details are spelled out. For instance, let's say you're doing a concrete structure, and you started pouring the elevated slabs, and you notice that the steel for the second pour has not been approved. That right there, or you don't see the rebar submittal on that schedule, then you know for sure that slab pour is going to be late. It's going to impact your schedule. Same thing with shop drawings. I mean, if you go walk the site and the drywall is in place and you don't see the cabinetry shop drawing, that's a lead item. That may take 2 months. If it's coming from China, for instance, on your countertop.
Amine.
Yes.
Can you talk to us about this tracking progress? I know this is overly simplistic, and you pointed out that critical path before us here is a lot more complex than that, but take us through briefly horizontal, vertical construction and just the concept here.
Sure. I know we skipped the QA/QC, but we'll get back to it in a minute. I'm going to try to go faster. We're just trying to keep with time here. Well, the schedule, usually this is what the industry is used to delivering. This is obviously a more simplistic critical path schedule. But what things you need to look for, obviously the first column has your tasks. There's usually a duration column, which is not shown here, but the length of the bar tells you the duration.
Sure.
And things what you need to look for here is to make sure that these tasks are logically sequenced, that the schedule is realistic. For instance, in this case, you can see that the site work is starting in April. Well, that's good because you're not going to have any impact from winter condition. But if I see a schedule where the earthwork is starting in October, I want to make sure there's a float in this schedule to account for any weather delays.
Sure.
The other thing that you want to look for is make sure there's a float. In case of something happens, there's room to catch up, or there's room to, if you fall behind, what tasks where you need to double up your manpower to catch up. Other things to think about is if your delivery, for instance, you're doing a mid-rise and the local jurisdiction has allowed for a floor-by-floor turnover, you want to make sure that all your life safety going to be in place, because you're not going to get that. Even if they're allowing you a TCO per floor, you're not going to get the TCO for the first floor until all your life safety systems or devices are in place and operational.
Amine, we have a question. Sorry, we have a question from the audience. In looking at this schedule, what in your experience is the biggest cause of delays?
It's getting off the ground.
So
and
the horizontal piece.
Yeah, and also lack of coordination. Lack of coordination, and basically people try to close on fast, and you close in on a set of drawing that is 70% complete versus what we typically like to see that's 85% complete.
Yeah,
those are really the main areas where we see delays and change order related that end up driving change orders.
Sure. No, I was going to say this next slide here is really your big tool, right? The G702, 703, your big tool, my big tool for really tracking costs. Can you talk a little bit about this application and cert for payment?
Certainly. Well, this tool has been developed by the American Institute of Architects. It is it's pretty much has become the standard since it was developed. It's a good tool that the contractors use to invoice and to avoid error. The left side is a box where we typically track the change orders. So if there's a change order, you will see it there, whether it's an additive change order or deductive change order. You want to make sure that the new ones are segregated, because once you've looked at the previous payout, for instance, in this case, change order 1 and 2 were previously approved, but this period we're dealing with the 107,000 change order. On the right side, it's pretty much a snapshot of the project financials. So you have the original contract amount on line item 1, then in your change orders, you add those two, you get your total completed and stored today. Then you have retainage, and the retainage provisions vary depending on, obviously they're negotiated, the underwriter requirements, but it's anywhere between 5 to 10%. And that's, you always want to make sure you have a retainage, because that's the incentive or the leverage you're going to use at the end of the project to get the contractor to finish up his punch work, to deliver full closeout package, et cetera, et cetera. The continuation sheets are basically, if you go to the next slide, Vinnie, they detail, it's a breakdown of the schedule of the budget. It's also referred to as a schedule of values, whereby each line item has a budget. And then if there's a change order that was issued, that column will get adjusted. Then you see your billing from the previous period. In this case, it's a $3,370,000. You can see and review the billing that was submitted this pay period. So the better the schedule value is detailed, the easiest it is to do a review. And it also depends on depends on the type of contract that has been executed. If it's a cost of the work contract, and the contractor is required to submit what we call a manifest billing, meaning support every invoice in with a subcontractor payout, you will get a payout for each line item, which breaks it in more detail. However, if it's a stipulated sum contract, then you'll rely heavily on these schedule values, and you look at the billing on a percentage of completion basis. In this case, this project is about 70% complete. You can see that they're billing $326,000 and another $162,000 in stored material.
Yep. I mean, we have a question for you and Sean, actually, with regards to horizontal construction being the biggest reason for delays. What is the best way to evaluate or mitigate the risk prior to closing on the site?
Well, we're going to go into a fair amount of detail on geotech coming up.
Yep.
I think that's going to be the answer. Amine, you agree?
Yes.
Geotechnical, Amine?
Yes, sir. The geotechnical is very important tool to mitigate most of the risk associated with unforeseen conditions. And it's basically a tool that prepares you to deal what's out there.
Right.
In the subgrade.
Yeah, let's move forward here then. Good. I'm going to talk briefly about this S-curve concept, and that blue line you see in front of you is I guess a projection of how the project will complete over time, the percent of the project spent. Can you guys talk briefly this S-curve concept in construction? Typically, every construction budget follows that slope, right? That S shape.
Yeah, we usually include it with our draws. Go ahead, Amine. I'm sorry.
Yeah, this is a really great tool whereby you take that pay application forecast of billing and you plot it against the timeline. An S-curve is really just the cumulative flow of money over time, and it's also a good graphical display on how the cost of your materials and labor are spent over time. In this case, obviously, this is a 12-month project that's running 2 months behind schedule, and you can see it. You look at the S-curve, it kind of starts flat, and then the slope of it picks up as you have more trades on the job, and then towards closing, it flattens again. But here you can see the project was anticipated to be completed in December, and here we are. The 2 months delay are easily recognizable, or you can identify that quickly.
We got a question on change orders. Do GCs not like to enter change orders in the original pay app lines? We struggle on tracking where exactly change order costs are incurred when they are all listed at the end. In affordable housing, it's more helpful to know what categories the additional costs fall into. I would agree with that, and I'm not even good point. Amine, your thoughts?
It's really an administrative task. Typically, the architect or the owner has the right to dictate how change orders will be handled. I don't think the AIA contracts really have any directive as to how it should be done, whether you take the change order and then you shake down you add a column, call it adjusted schedule value, and you distribute the cost impact related to each trade separately, or you can add it at the end. I prefer the first one, especially if you're doing a manifest billing and you're looking at subs pay apps, then it's easy to track them. You can track their change order billing. Now, if they lump them all together as a one line item at the bottom, what we do to approve, to process that change order is we request a separate breakdown of it. Mm-hmm. And you'll get a separate schedule, separate sheet. That way you could say, hey, we had a change order related to plumbing fixtures. They've installed 20% of the extra ones, then they've earned 20%. So it's really, again, it's really an administrative task that the owner and the developer or architect can always direct the contractor to break it down.
So
and you got to remember.
Just a quick follow-up question to that then. Wouldn't the contract between the developer general contractor dictate how? You're right, AIA doesn't dictate it, but couldn't the contract for the project detail the level of specificity?
You can, if it's something, if any provision is added to the standard agreement.
Yep. Let's move forward here. This is a project, as you can see in front of you, behind schedule. This next one ahead of schedule, and then this third one. We've seen a few of these in our time, haven't we? Just a project that goes completely. The curve is almost going sideways, almost flattens out, but a project that just gets into trouble. Very likely a workout. If this is a tax credit project, which we're not talking about today, but if it was, we'd be in real big trouble here. we've got a project that's potentially not placing in service, or just behind schedule, and here are the potential issues you run into. I've highlighted those. Amine, you want to talk a little bit about schedule red flags?
Sure. So a lot of times.
Go ahead.
Sorry?
No, go ahead.
Yeah. So a lot of times, obviously, as I mentioned early on, the clock starts ticking by the issuance of the notice to proceed, which is basically the legal document that tells the contractor and the requirements of the executed contract, you are hereby directed to start. A lot of times, the notice to proceed is not really, it's tied up to other aspects of the projects really that are not related to construction. Sometimes the loan closing, sometimes permitting. So your baseline schedule that was presented at pre-closing obviously would need to be adjusted. So you want to make sure that your baseline schedule is up to date, and you have starting point to start tracking the project. And also, it's also critical that schedule gets updated, that you get monthly updates. So if there are any delay impacts, you're aware of what's going on. Again, a lot of time we see schedules that are really where the baseline is not realistic. For instance, we've had sites where the soils were not, we had expensive soils, and we had to place a surcharge that was going to take 60 days, before the pads are ready for construction, and the contractor has not accounted for that, or there was a miscommunication between the geotech and the contractor. Obviously, if you have adverse conditions, you want to make sure the schedule is updated to account for these.
Our friend Vernon asked me about, from a developer standpoint, what's a good tenant relocation plan look like? I think that could be a 2-hour webcast in itself. Certainly a detail. I'll answer that question because I deal with it a lot in affordable housing. But just to say that, it's one thing to have a plan that management agrees with, the developer agrees with, a plan that's reasonable, and a plan that, that's communicated with the site staff, and of course the residents, letting them know what's going to happen. I know that doesn't do justice to your question, Vernon, but tenant relocation is a big piece of this. You're absolutely right. Moving residents around for a rehab. I'm sorry we can't do more justice to it with only 15 minutes left in our webcast, but it's an important piece of what we do here. Absolutely. I think the bottom line is communication among all stakeholders when you're dealing with relocation. That's the biggest piece. So we've kind of gotten through basic tracking, and Amine and Sean put their heads together and said, of all the things we've seen over the years, they've kind of distilled it down to issues that can really drag a project down from the get-go. And we're going to kind of step it up a little bit to get through these, but they're also going to share some great examples on, the kinds of things, again, common challenges to ACK rehab and new construction. So, Amine, you want to take us through these?
Yes, sir. So basically, there's 5 elements here that we see most of the time: permit requirements, contracting, issues with the QA, QC, and then unforeseen conditions, and obviously design coordination issues.
Sure.
With respect to with respect to contracting, as I said, you want to make sure that the set that's been priced is at least 85 to 90% complete. What we call, you've gone through the permit requirements, you have an approved set. Typically, that's about the percentage, and then
Sure.
The 10%, it's typical. It gets dealt with during the construction phase if there are any deferred submittals, and the completion of the drawings.
Sure.
We're gonna touch base on the importance of the QA QC and how can things get out of whack during construction because of a lack of proper program in place, or third-party consultants with really limited scope because of financial aspects.
Hey guys, on the construction team, is it the architect that you can really rely on for QA/QC, or is it someone else? Or is it you guys, the third party that comes in and does an independent inspection? How do you really accomplish QA/QC? I mean,
well, the process starts by who you selected to do your geotechnical investigation, because most of the time, you want to make sure that the firm that does the geotech usually does the materials testing, and you want to make sure, you want to ensure continuity and hire that same firm. And then you have third-party consultants, and basically boils down to two: an envelope consultant and an ADA/FHA consultant. Because those are the big-ticket items if something goes wrong.
Take us through these last two. Take us through these last two, and then we'll jump into some really good examples.
Yeah. Design completion, you just want to make sure, again, you have good coordination. Keep in mind, if you push into close on a deal where you have 70% complete drawings, you better have a design contingency. We typically see outside your hard cost contingency, just a design completion contingency, whereby we typically, we've seen budgets go up from 1% to 3% just from the original estimates when you fast track in a project and you don't have very good complete set of drawings. With respect to rehabs, obviously you want to make sure you have a well-detailed scope of work. Sometimes it's a light rehab and you don't need a set of drawings, and then that you're doing things you move in walls, whereby in the middle of things, the inspector will come in and say, hey, where's the drawings? What you move in this load-bearing wall, and then you incur time trying to put something together at the end, or you don't have specs, and without specifications, you're given a great leeway to subcontractors to pick whatever they want. So you want to make sure you have a tight contract where everything is tied up to a clearly defined scope of work and specs. And the biggest one is unforeseen conditions, which we're going to discuss a little bit on detail. Unforeseen conditions with new construction, one of the best tools available out there is your geotechnical report tool.
Right. Is the geotechnical updated? Is that something that's issued pre-ground break and then never updated thereafter, or how does that work?
Well, here's what happened. One of the most typical issue we see is there's a lack of clear guidance on spending on a geotechnical investigation. When you're at the pre-acquisition, you're looking at land. You don't know if the deal's going to go through. You hire geotech. You say, hey, this is what I want to do. At that time, your design is still conceptual, and you don't want to spend a lot of money. And, instead of doing 10 borings, you end up doing 2. I mean, it's good. It gives you a preliminary feel, but you got to take it next step. And a lot of time, what we see is these preliminary geotech reports never get updated. Here's an example. This is a 3-story building, a very simple site where you have the parking lot in the middle as far as layout, and then you have a detention pond on the left side. If you can go to the next slide, Vinny.
Yes.
And this is what they had done. So they had drilled 5 borings. But when you look closely and try to sort of overlay your site plan against this, you can tell they didn't test the detention pond area. And that's where you're going to excavate the most. If you have rock or, water issues there, or what we call partially wetted rock, you have a problem. You're going to have change order there, trying to dig your detention pond to reach the design capacity. Same thing here in the middle of the parking lot. Nothing was tested. So you want to make sure you have good coverage, and it's money well spent. I mean, you're talking about maybe less than $10,000 to added to the geotechnical firm to get a good coverage, good understanding. The other thing that we see almost every time that's not tested is your utility trenches, and that's where you have your deep cuts. We get a lot of change orders for blasting during the sewer installation, doing anything related to the utilities. So those are two things to always look for. And here we're going to go to, besides some of the unforeseen conditions are, sometimes it's related to the means and methods. And this is an example on a project that we did in Texas, where the geotechnical engineer, as part of their recommendations, they had recommended to install a temporary shoring system, and that's what you see in the picture at the bottom. However, the contractor elected not to do it. He said, "Oh, we're gonna just slope it. We're gonna be fine." A week later, there was a significant amount of rain. The slopes collapsed. The road collapsed. The street had to be shut down, and it turned out to a $450,000 change order claim that we had to deal with.
What kind of delay was there? I mean, the dollar amount is $500,000, but what about the time delay in this case? I mean,
well, the biggest delay is that the developer tried to run it through an insurance claim, and to do that, obviously you have to wait.
First
of all, there's shutdown. There's the county utility guys needed to get involved to figure out where the leaks that were caused came from. But this was probably a 4-month delay before we really picked up production where we were supposed to be. This is another type of unforeseen conditions that really, sometimes the development team and the construction team, that there are things that are not well coordinated. In this case, most of the time, anything related to the easements is the responsibility of the owner. So they had obtained the FFA approval, but nobody took a close look at the height restrictions. Initially, we had a crane erected, your standard crane, to do the podium part. But then when we got to the point where we needed to jack it up, the FAA shut down the job, said you can't do that. So to overcome that, we basically had to come up with a solution, which was obtaining a self-erecting crane and working only within the hours where the line of sight was not impacting the runways of Reagan. This is the same project that early on, where we had to drive the steel piles or a tieback system because there's a storage next door. And again, when we brought the rig in to the site, it was too high. They had to use a forklift, believe it or not, to drive those H-piles. And the results of this, we're going to see it in the next slide. There's your appending, your PCO log with a $50,000 worth of extra costs related to the FAA restrictions, and then you can see your schedule impacts, basically related to the delay right below it.
So what's the bottom line here? Almost, it's an expensive mistake.
Yeah, that was roughly $110,000 right there that, nobody thought about of.
Yeah, here's a quick question. How to confirm that the scope of work for a rehab project is adequate and will not cause any serious trouble later requiring more work and more funds?
Well, I think the key to that is doing a capital needs assessment before you do the rehab, but also looking at any destructive testing that may or may not have been done. You can literally spend limitless amounts of money to try to limit those change orders on a rehab project, but the question is, do you have drawings? Is it an older site? You have no drawings, maybe a historical site or some adaptive reuse site. So I think that's tough because it is a question of how you really can spend limitless money developing your scope of work, and your capital needs assessment and the visual look at you get at that before you go at your scope of work may include destructive testing that you're going to have to do to find some of these unforeseen conditions before you start.
Here we have another example that's related really to coordination. This is a deal in North Carolina where basically the plumbing and structural drawings were not coordinated. Every time in a wood frame, and every time you go beyond 3 stories, you have to account for wood shrinkage. And typically the structural requirements and structural code will dictate how big your notching could be on your framing.
Sure.
But here nobody was paying attention to that, and once the project was completed, and then started going through a couple cycles of heating and cooling, all the risers started snapping, and we had to go back and add what we call compression boots, and that's what you saw on the other picture.
Amine,
good example.
I'm going to take us, for the sake of time, to your QA/QC discussion, starting with your materials testing, if you would.
Well, the materials testing is very important. One thing we always advise that you make sure there's a deficiency log developed, because every time there's an issue, a responsible party, either a structural engineer of record, the architect, or the MEP, somebody has to sign off on it. And a lot of time, if you're doing a concrete structure, you're going to get a 1,000 concrete report, and things fell through the cracks. You want to make sure you have a good tracking mechanism in place. And also, if there is an ADA, FHA consultant, you want to make sure you're getting copies of these reports. Part of the QA/QC also, there's mock-up requirements. Those are good tools to work out all the kinks. For instance, on the exterior skin, or if you're doing a apartment, sometimes a mock-up is done prior to even getting into the framing stage. And the purpose of the mock-up is not only for product selection, but also to work out all the coordination issues. Make sure things fit together. How they're going to be finished. For instance, on windows, you're looking at your flashing. When you have the similar material, you want to make sure your transitions are appropriate. You want to make sure also that the contractor is not taking shortcuts. For instance, on the windows, you have different testing requirements. You could do a hose test, or you could do a chamber test, where basically you account for wind-driven effects and try to mitigate any leaks. Sometimes the windows could be defective from the manufacturer, and you wouldn't know if you haven't done tests.
Good.
Another example of ADFHA that we see all the time, nobody bothers to measure field conditions. I mean, everything looks fine on the drawings, but this is a deal where we had 200 units and all the toilets didn't meet the FHA requirements. There's not enough clearance. So this turned out to be a couple $100,000 issue that we had to deal with at closing. So you want to be proactive, and things that you can address during construction. You got to spend that money. It's worth it. It's well worth it. So
you may have to do, in addition to, you would hope the architect knew those requirements, but bring in an ADA FHA specialist in this case.
During construction, right, and try to catch these after the mock-up or a few units are done rather than all 200.
Sure. We're going to skip contract red flags. I feel like you've discussed some of this throughout the webcast. And guys, it's just a little bit past 3 o'clock. If we could, we've got 4 pages of tips. If you could just kind of pull out the important ones on each of these pages, I guess thoughts you want to leave our audience with today as we wrap up.
Yeah, just quickly on the first one, I think we didn't talk about qualifications of the development team. That's really important. See that they've done projects, they've done them in that market, they have good subcontractor arrangements, they're bondable. Also, looking at the local requirements for building codes and zoning and parking requirements and fire and life safety ahead of time. Also, we mentioned a little bit about destructive testing in advance during the due diligence phase for rehab projects to uncover unforeseen conditions. Amine touched a lot on geotech. There are some slides in there for everyone to look at later on environmental, but normally it's things like asbestos. If you plan to light rehab and you're doing something substantial and you have asbestos everywhere and you didn't know it, you're going to be in for a big change order. Amine also mentioned, I think, continuity of the geotech engineer, so the person that did the original boring should also be retained to perform the materials testing. The institutional knowledge there is pretty invaluable.
Sure.
Amine, you want to pick up from there?
Yeah, and always, I get this all the time where they're trying to close and they don't have a permit. You got to understand that the permit is the only legal documents that gives you the right to build the project as designed, and also it ensures that they have gone through the local process. So if there's any change order tied into the permitting requirements, you address it right there, in the contract amount. You don't want it to be, because contingency obviously is for the unforeseen. You want to make sure that you have all your utility availability letters. I get this all the time where they tell me, oh, well, all the utilities are shown on the civil drawings, but the purpose of getting these letters is to confirm that the capacity exists.
Right. Any thoughts on this third page of tips, Amine? Any one stands out to you? Any big one?
Yeah, the seeking timely guidance from local authority, that's very important in rehabs, to be proactive and talk. You don't want to wait till the end, until during the inspection process where they're going to come back and hit you with something. You want to make sure, if the fire marshal is requiring something, or if there's any other permitting requirements, you have a full understanding of it and it's in writing.
Sure.
A lot of time.
Sean, anything on this last page of tips that you want to call out and share before we wrap up this webcast?
I just think buying out the trades is always important. We talked a lot about that. A lot of times the MEP is design build, and that's always going to be lagging, but it's also one of your largest cost items. We didn't talk about value engineering. That could be a webinar in and of itself. So we obviously like to stay away from that if you can, because then you depart from maybe the quality that you had anticipated, and it's a series of trade-offs that you need to make so you don't blow your contingency and you meet your budget and potentially your schedule as well. I think we have some recommended contingencies: 5% new construction, 10% AC rehab. As Amine said, there are other contingencies to be considered, like design if you don't have an adequate permit set progression, and then managing all the the punch list items for the final C of O and track the warranty issues so that you're turning over a nice package to the operating team when the project does get its TCO or C of O and is ready for lease up.
Thanks, Sean. Thanks, Amine. I just want to take 30 seconds to say thank you to Blackstone for offering this complimentary webcast today. If any of you have questions, follow up. You've got Amine and Sean's email. You guys are national. You provide a lot more than just construction monitoring services, and they've got really some great experts on staff. Amine, you can't see it, but on our question panel, we got some thank yous and some great jobs. I just want to pass that along. So I don't see any other questions. It's about 3:05, and I want to thank you all. Sean, again, Amine, for your time today and sharing this knowledge. I hope to see you all again on another Birch Island webcast in 2017. All the best to all of you, and look forward to chatting again.
And thank you, Vinnie, for Birch Island, for your e-learning capabilities, capacity, and being a leader in providing this training.
Thank you. All right. All the best to everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.